again. But I had a bit of coffee and I talked to Kumpe for a while. So, a little late. Okay. So you've all did the meditation on the breath, I guess. All right, so you're calm enough. That's right, jump into it. Okay, great. So again, we're in the sacred place of Balchamas Mountain. Most importantly, we are in the presence of the Buddha himself. It's a manifestation of all the qualities we ourselves can attain. Serving as a guide, an example for what is possible. And his mere presence puts our mind at rest. And close to the Buddha are his disciples, the Sangha. Consisting of monks, nuns, lay people. With different realizations and aspirations. And while the Buddha can be compared to a doctor, they're like the nurses. Helping us to take the medicine that is the Dharma. For what purpose? Well, not just for our own benefit, but for the benefit of all sentient beings who are surrounding you. With those who we resent or who resent us right in front of us. Again, based on the understanding that it is our self-centeredness and our sense of distance between ourselves and others that causes so much suffering. Generate a sense of deep affection and closeness towards all sentient beings. Supported by the understanding that I and other are merely relative. That is a matter of perspective. And then generate great compassion for all these beings, wishing them to be free from the three types of suffering: suffering of suffering, suffering of change, and pervasive conditioned suffering. As well as wishing to protect them from these three types of suffering. And as that aspiration grows stronger, it transforms into a type of inner strength based on joy and courage. That's totally determined to work towards assisting sentient beings to overcome their three types of suffering. And possibly even the obstructions to enlightenment. And since that is realistically only possible after we became enlightened ourselves, let's then, for the benefit of all sentient beings, generate the aspiration, the determination to attain the enlightened state, the awakened state of a Buddha. It's also our motivation for completing our study of the Heart Sutra. And while keeping our visualization and our motivation, mind of enlightenment, let's recite the prayers together, focusing on the meaning of these words. I take refuge until I'm enlightened in the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly. By my accumulations of generosity and so forth, may I become a Buddha to benefit transmigratory beings. I take refuge until I'm enlightened in the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly. By my accumulations of generosity and so forth, may I become a Buddha to benefit transmigratory beings. I take refuge until I'm enlightened in the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly. By my accumulations of generosity and so forth, may I become a Buddha to benefit transmigratory beings. May all sentient beings have happiness and the causes of happiness. May all sentient beings be free from suffering and the causes of suffering. May all sentient beings never be separated from the happiness that knows no suffering. And may all sentient beings abide in equanimity, free of attachment and hatred for those held close and distant. How was the puja last night? Did you enjoy it? Okay. Okay. All right, so let's finish the Heart Sutra, the last part, and then I briefly go over it again just to give you a full sense of what we discussed, or a summary of what we discussed, before we start to talk about Tantra. Okay, anyway, first, the rest of the text, which is the kind of approval by the Buddha, and in that way also an encouragement to practice what the Buddha taught. What the Buddha taught, of course, here in this case, not directly speaking from his own mouth, as they would say in Tibetan, but rather through others, having blessed their mental continuum, inspired, blessed their mental continuum. Okay, so where are we? Then it says, the Bhagavan arose from that. Oh, sorry, Shariputra, the Bodhisattva Mahasattva, should train in the profound perfection of wisdom like that. So Avalokiteshvara completes his explanation. So I said early on, sorry, this is right. So anyway, so he completes his explanation, his answer in response to Shariputra's question, saying this is exactly how you should train. Okay, to just kind of wrap it up basically. And then the Bhagavan arose from that concentration. What concentration is that? Pardon?
The profound perfection of wisdom. Oh, profound perception, sorry.
The profound perception, yes, or the profound appearance, very good. So the Bhagavan arose, but did he really arose? Did he really arise from that? No, because he's always in it. So it just looked like that. Because like for us ordinary beings, we can't meditate at the same time as we talk. We can't remain in a meditative state, especially not in a direct perception of emptiness, and talk at the same time. So to common appearance, it seemed the Buddha arose. And that also reflects what I talked about many times before, at least a few times before, saying that the Buddhas manifest according to our needs, according to our understanding and so forth. So they may do things ordinary people do, of course for our benefit. So sometimes in the scriptures you find the explanation that a teacher who may be fully enlightened, or at least be a bodhisattva, or someone more advanced at least than we are, that such a person, if the disciple likes to drink alcohol, they may manifest as in like really liking to drink alcohol, because to such a person you can relate. If someone has similar I don't know, likes and dislikes and maybe weaknesses as well, it's really helpful to meet someone who seems to be similar, because if someone is just beyond us, we can't relate to that person. So being able to relate to the disciples is an important part of a qualified master. Okay. Anyway, so the Bhagavan arose from that concentration and commended the Bodhisattva Mahasattva Arya Avalokiteshvara, saying, and now the Buddha himself speaks, so it's not very long. Well said, well said, well said, well said, son of the lineage. So he, of course, he doesn't say son of daughter of the lineage, obvious, because he's talking about Avalokiteshvara. It is like that. It is like that. One should practice the profound perfection of wisdom, just as you have indicated. Even the Tathagatas rejoice. Okay, so sometimes it's translated as you have indicated, therefore the Tathagatas, even the Buddhas rejoice, right? Okay, so Tathagatas is just another word for Buddhas, so even the Buddhas. So because of what you said, the Tathagatas rejoice. Well said, well said. He actually says, well, well. Well done, or well, well, actually, which would translate to well said or well done. Okay. So with this, he gives his approval. With this, he says everything that has been said previously, that is in accordance with my intention, with my teachings, with all the Buddha's teachings. And again, emphasizing that the previous explanation are the words of the Buddha in that indirect sense, that he approves of them. And of course, so he has blessed the continuum of Avalokiteshvara's inspired the mental continuum of Avalokiteshvara. So that's all the Buddha says. And then at the very end it says the Bhagavan. Again, it goes back. Sometimes he's described as the Buddha, except at the very beginning he's described as the Bhagavan, and at the very end described as the Bhagavan. But in between the word Buddha is used. So now going back to saying the Bhagavan. Oh no, the Bhagavan was also before actually. Then the Bhagavan arose from that concentration. But previously it was addressed as the Buddha, like when you went into the concentration, the word Buddha was used for whatever reason. So the Bhagavan having thus spoken, the Venerable Sharadvati Putra, the son of the Sharadvati family, the Bodhisattva Mahasattva Arya Avalokiteshvara, those surrounding in their entirety along with the world of gods, humans, Asuras and Gandharvas, were overjoyed and highly praised that spoken by the Bhagavan. So in other words, here it's saying that not just those that were previously mentioned were present there, but also beings from the celestial realms, of course also humans, Asuras and Gandharvas. So again, beings like semi-celestial being and so forth. So there are these different types of beings. Anyway, they were all They were all pleased. They were all very delighted by what the Buddha had said. Just a sec, I'm just going back. Yes. Yeah, so basically it's talking about celestial beings, semi-celestial beings. Also, there's like this idea of like, they're called smell eaters actually. That's a really, so Gandharvas, they're said to be a type of living beings whose bodies are much subtler, and they sustain themselves by relying on smells, for instance. I mean, even in between beings in the pardo state, in the pardo, which is a state between this life, for instance, or when we die, and before we're reborn, there's like an intermediate state in which it's also explained that we'll feed off smells, right? I mean, smells, what are smells? They're molecules basically, that you breathe in, but they're not sufficient, they're not, I mean, just breathing them in won't fill our bellies and really sustain us. But if you have a very subtle body, then just these molecules that we would consider to be smell, they live of them. So it's different to us. They have a very different body, need different nourishment, and that's why they're called smell eaters. And in Tibetan tradition, when someone passes away, they sometimes put tsamba, which has, like especially fresh tsamba, has a unique smell, a very delicious type of smell. So it's this roasted barley that has been ground. It's grinded. I mean, it's been ground to like a flour, and then you mix butter and cheese. So butter also has a strong smell, especially if it's a little older, which is considered to be actually quite delicious. Just as we enjoy blue cheese, which is also weird for some cultures. Anyway, so you mix that butter, that slightly kind of older butter, with some cheese, a special type of cheese. There's no yak cheese, by the way. Yak is the male animal, right? No, D. It's like from the female version. So they mix that with the tsamba and the butter, and it's got a strong smell, and it's supposed to feed this person who's passed away, who's now in the pardo, and they have a much subtler body. And that subtler body is actually explained in Tantra, why you can have such a subtle body. We'll speak a little bit about that, like a pardo being's body, a dream body, a mental body, because it's very closely connected to the mental, but it's not the mind itself. Anyway, we'll discuss this. But the point being here, this particular being also feeds off the smell. Although some would argue, this pardo being is not going to hang around much, because the karmic force carries it towards wherever it's going to be reborn. But there's some disagreement. Some would say it actually stays behind. And I guess it's definitely debatable, but who knows how attached, if you really attach to this home and so forth, the mind may actually remain for some time. So we don't really know. But there's this discussion, how far do they actually linger and enjoy that food. But anyway, it's out of the motivation to benefit this being, of course, a family member, someone close to you, a loved one, to feed them with that. And again, in that way also, someone who feeds off smells. Anyway, so what it's saying at the very end is that many beings benefited from these teachings, beings that we don't perceive, we don't even believe in their existence. Anyway, yeah, I want to say something about that, but it's not the right time at this point. So anyway, and they praise the words of the Buddha at the very end. So you see there's joy involved. First of all, the Buddha's approval. Then there's joy, the sense of joy, which I find very important. The fact that it's stressed again here, there's good reason to be joyful about what the Buddha has taught, the kind of medicine he's given to us, he's made available to us. And as I mentioned yesterday, there are different types of joy that are really important. But it's not joy we find outside of ourselves. That's our problem. That's our problem, that we keep searching for joy outside of ourselves. So we enjoy certain external objects instead of internalizing the teachings and being joyful about that, or finding this inner joy. So Tantra is a practice that is very much based on that. Our sense of being incomplete, our sense of missing something, and always looking for it at the outside, right? And of course, great disappointment when the object doesn't last, when our joy doesn't last, or our enjoyment doesn't last. And we're so busy in searching for something else that replaces it. And that this constant longing for something that seems amiss, something that we are lacking, is also responsible for our lack of concentration. Because the moment we focus, there's another longing just to have this thought, just to think about this. There's this constant desire, which is why concentration is so difficult. Right? That our whole existence, every thought, there's some longing behind it. Want to think about this, want to think about that. So concentration becomes really difficult. But in order to now, well, first of all, wrap up the explanation of the sutra. So, well, there's this happiness in terms of these teachings, having found these teachings, being able to internalize it. And of course then praising the Buddha, kind of not for the Buddha's sake, but for the sake of ourselves and for others. To emphasize his qualities, to express his qualities, to appreciate them, a sense of appreciation and gratitude, which again are very, very healthy states of mind. I mean, just from the point of view of basic psychology, they're states of mind that bring with them a sense of joy, a sense of peace, they calm our mind and make it more receptive, right? So joy, devotion, sense of appreciation and gratitude. Okay, all right, and so that's the sutra. That is the Heart Sutra. Okay, now to go over it one more time, just as I said, to summarize it. The actual sutra, of course, doesn't start with a name, but the translators added nevertheless the Sanskrit name and the Tibetan name. So the Sanskrit for, well, mainly Tibetans, because we're talking about the Tibetan translators here, to show that it is a text that comes from India, that its origin is Sanskrit, that it was taught by the Buddha. Well, just the Sanskrit title doesn't indicate that it was taught by the Buddha, but at least it's an authentic text, going back to the Indian Buddhist tradition. And then there's the description, one section, you know why that is, and then why that is given. Then there's the homage by the translators, and the actual text starts with a prologue first, a common prologue, which is said to describe 4, they say sometimes 5 excellent aspects, or at least give you the background of the sutra. What is the time it was taught, the time when sentient beings' minds was ripe, and also, and here's some disagreement, when was the exact time? Was it 1 year of the Buddha's enlightenment? Was it when the Buddha was around 57, 58? Anyway, there's some disagreement on that. There are many different times given in different commentaries. But at some point, definitely after the Buddha had turned the wheel of the Four Noble Truths, or the first wheel of Dharma, he gave these teachings to a particular audience. So the special audience is described. It's said to be an audience that had developed a certain type of pure, or that had a certain type of pure karma. Because not everyone would have perceived what is going on. Even if they were present, they wouldn't have been able to follow this dialogue and so forth. So the ones whose minds were ripe, had ripened enough to receive these teachings, those are mentioned as the excellent audience. So time, audience, the teacher is mentioned as being present, of course, the teacher, the Buddha, who's like a doctor, like a physician. And the place, this very sacred place. Sacred in terms of, well, in close proximity to Vulture's Mass Mountains, which was considered to be a spiritual place, was the town of Rajgriha, which was said to be a very good town for lay people following their ordinary life, like engaging in commerce and what have you. And then being also in these hills, the Rajgriha Mountains, as they're still called Rajgriha Mountains, so the sacred place, sacred in different traditions. Anyway, and the Dharma being implied, in some commentaries they say the Dharma, the fifth excellency, if you like, that is implied, being a Dharma that contains all three types of teachings by Buddha. Teaching by way of having received the permission of the Buddha, or blessed teachings by way of receiving the blessings, and the Buddha's own words. But some would say the excellent Dharma is only expressed in the next passage, which is the uncommon prologue, when it talks about Avalokiteshvara being, well, the Buddha, both Avalokiteshvara and the Buddha, both focusing on emptiness, which is said to be the excellent teaching here, perfection of wisdom, in other words, and through that, of course, its object, emptiness. Anyway, in the uncommon prologue, as I just said, this describes what the Buddha did and what Avalokiteshvara did. Okay, so again, as I mentioned earlier, the sense of the Buddha, the teacher, passing on his knowledge to his disciple Avalokiteshvara, who in turn then passes it on to other great beings, and in that way there's an unbroken lineage of realized beings passing on their understanding. That makes a huge difference, because when someone teaches with a realization of that which they teach, it affects us differently. It makes sense. I mean, it's not just the words we speak, as we nowadays know, of course, that a lot of, I mean, modern psychology talks about the fact that a lot of communication does not just happen through the words, but through the expression of the person, right? And so a person who realizes, who has realizations of that which they teach, of course, is their expressions, is their whole physical demeanor. And there's a special blessing, as they would say, a special power or a special energy that comes through what they said, which then affects us quite differently. Therefore, this unbroken lineage, that actually holds all this power, because it's passed on from the Buddha to the next person, so it carries something with it through every master. Now, scientifically at this point, like, we don't know what they're talking about. It doesn't seem to have any scientific grounding, but just because scientists haven't found that yet doesn't mean it doesn't exist. I mean, there's still so much to discover. We know already about the expressions, how a person communicates so much through, the tone of their voice, of course. The tone of their voice, the speed and everything. So all of this plays into what they're communicating. Okay. Anyway, having said all this, so therefore you have the common, the uncommon prologue, and then the question, Shariputra's question directed at Avalokiteshvara, asking about the practice of the perfection of wisdom of someone who has now entered the Mahayana, or the Mahayana path, the path of accumulation, of course because of their bodhicitta, their mind of enlightenment, and we discussed it in great detail, what that means. Okay, and then explicitly Avalokiteshvara answers. He talks about, first of all, we should practice, we should meditate on the emptiness of the five aggregates, okay, in a very concise way. And then he elaborates. He says, if you take those five aggregates, and I haven't mentioned the implicit part yet, so if you perceive the five aggregates, we'll start with the body and understand the body doesn't exist inherently. But it nevertheless exists. Emptiness is form, so therefore it nevertheless exists. Because, well, due to its emptiness, it can actually function, it can grow, it can, well, go out of existence, come into existence, go out of existence, and so forth. And that its emptiness, this ultimate nature, this characteristic it has, that it is inseparably linked, that it's of one nature with the body. But that doesn't mean that they're identical. It's just one aspect. And seen with different minds, they appear differently. So they are nominally different. Okay. And thereafter, he also mentions the other aggregates, saying, well, the same is true for feeling, discrimination. So this is true for everything, okay, for the person, of course. Previously, he said also the 5 aggregates are empty as part of this initial response, and implied by that is, of course, the person, him or herself, is also empty of inherent existence. Anyway, so having specifically talked about the 5 aggregates, now he addresses different characteristics, different aspects with respect to the 5 aggregates, but also with respect to other phenomena. So saying phenomena are empty. They have no inherent, so they're inherently empty, or they lack inherent existence. They lack inherent characteristics. They're not inherently produced, they don't inherently cease. They're not inherently with stains, they're not inherently without stains. They're not inherently deficient, and they're not inherently complete, or they don't inherently increase or inherently decrease. So talking less about the person and the aggregates, but more about the different functions, the different characteristics, and so forth, stressing those by way of the 8 aspects. And then the text is even more detailed with regard to now talking about, first of all, what is it? Talking about emptiness from the point of view of what experiences samsara. The 5 aggregates, that's samsara. What is samsara? It's the 5 aggregates. They experience samsara, so that's samsara. And again saying they lack inherent existence, going through each one of them. So we may feel, oh, just saying the 5 aggregates, they lack inherent existence, that's enough. Or as to this next category of phenomena that are described as lacking inherent existence, the 12 sense sources, which shows how we experience, how the 5 aggregates experience samsara. By way of what? The sense sources. We have a sense, I could have just said the 12 sense sources lack inherent existence. Yeah, it would be just as correct. But the text is meant for us to meditate on. And if you take each individual aspect and you reflect on its conventional existence, first understand it, and then, of course, its ultimate existence as explicitly taught, so in that case, it's much more effective. It has a much more powerful effect on our mind. So to internalize it, taking every little aspect, it's so different from just briefly thinking about it in general, of course, obviously. Anyway, so it describes the 5 aggregates, then it describes the 12 sense sources as that which, as like the basis for our experiences, being the objects and the physical as well as the mental sense source or sense faculty. Then it uses those 12 and adds also the experiencing entity, which are the 6 consciousnesses. So you end up with the 18 constituents, adding to the 12 sense sources these 6 minds. And having said all that, then it describes how we wander in samsara through the 12 links, implicitly, but explicitly talks about their emptiness. That's the extensive version of how we wander in samsara and what are the causes for samsara, what are the symptoms, and of course how we can, seeing the 12 links from a afflicted as well as a purified aspect. We talked about that, the afflicted and the purified aspect. Having realized, having eliminated ignorance, we eliminate, and so forth, all the way to the last limb, which is the last link, which is aging and death. Anyway, so that is discussed, and then the 4 Noble Truths, to summarize it, well, those are conventionally, they are the 4 Noble Truths, but they lack inherent existence. And likewise, for anything else, there's no attainment, there's no non-attainment, no exalted wisdom, and so forth. So that description, here in this case, kind of saying basically what is in samsara and what is liberated. Well, none of those exist inherently. And then basically saying, this is how we should practice. This is the kind of practice to take this to mind. The bodhisattvas practice in that way, understanding that at some point they're free from obscurations, free from fear and so forth. And eventually they attain the state of a Buddha. And the Buddhas of the 3 times, of course, practice in the same way. So here, of course, it's important to also mention the implicit meaning, where in the beginning the path of accumulation is mentioned, the path of preparation, the path of seeing, the path of meditation, and eventually the path of no more learning. All that is implied, and especially by the last words, it becomes obvious that that's the path of no more learning in terms of the Buddhas. And then everything that has been taught, explicitly as well as implicitly, especially the implicit teachings, they are then summarized by the mantra, by that which protects our mind, being the perfection of wisdom, but in the form, now expressed in the form of a mantra. So saying, describing the mantra of great knowledge, the mantra of great perfection of great knowledge and so forth, the equal of the unequaled, etc., the unsurpassed. Anyway, having said all that, the actual mantra is given, which is a concise or a summary of everything that has been said before. And for some disciples, that would actually suffice to understand everything taught before, how to believe. And in the end, Avalokiteshvara says, well, this is how we should practice. And then, of course, comes the Buddha's approval, praising him, Avalokiteshvara, for what he said and giving his approval, putting the seal on it, if you like, the seal of approval in that sense. And at the end, everyone is happy, and implied by that, puts it into practice, praising the Buddha, etc. Well, that's the perfection of wisdom. Well, that's the Heart Sutra, which is one of the perfection of wisdom sutras, but which is said to contain everything this huge body of teachings sets forth or indicates or teaches. Okay. So now that you know its meaning, of course, when you recite it, you should reflect on it in that way, right? Reflect on emptiness, especially form is empty, emptiness is form, and so forth. Yeah, to not just recite it, but to reflect on its meaning, and more so internalize its meaning, meditate on its meaning. And you may have to take a break while you recite it and maybe meditate on it. But yes, so in order to understand method and wisdom both better, this sutra is very effective. And I mean, of course, from there you may expand your study to get more detailed explanations. But then every time you go back to the Heart Sutra, all that comes together, all that you've learned comes together in that sutra. And in that way, it's not like spread out kind of different concepts that are difficult to connect. No, they all connect in this sutra. Okay, yes?
Can you suggest any literature for us to be able to deepen our knowledge of emptiness?
Oh, some literature about this.
Or just like books or anything?
Oh, there's so much. I mean, the texts that are usually studied in Tibetan Buddhism, for instance, especially in the Gelugpa tradition, are Chandakirti's Entering the Middle Way, and then Lama Tsongkhapa's commentary on that, Illumination of the Intent, as it's called. And there's a very good translation out now by Thupten Jinpa. He's translated the entire text, right? And it's a very good translation, so you can actually read it. But it's difficult to understand without an explanation. It's not easy to understand, so it still requires a commentary by someone to understand it. There's the classic book that has been out for many, many years is, for instance, Meditation on Emptiness. But it doesn't just talk about emptiness, it talks about a lot of other ideas. So, so many books, oh my gosh, there's so much on emptiness. Of course, His Holiness's books always teach emptiness. They are very good. There's Ocean of Reasoning, of course, Lama Tsongkhapa's commentary on fundamental wisdom, which is the commentary on the Buddha's teachings on the perfection. I mean, the explicit teachings on the perfection of wisdom of the perfection of wisdom sutras. So Nagarjuna's fundamental wisdom, which in itself is impossible to understand. So then you have Lama Tsongkhapa's commentary, Ocean of Reasoning, translated, but it's a little difficult because the vocabulary, J. Garfield, for instance, one of the authors he uses is quite different. Instead of non-affirming and affirming negation, he talks about external negation, which is quite unusual. Anyways, so it's difficult to understand. I mean, I find the Tibetan easier than the English, to be honest. But anyway, so there are these books, and of course you held it the other day. Excuse me, I don't know your name, sorry.
My name?
Yes?
Manu.
Manu. So you held this book. There's a book you read on Insight. What is it called? It's with this green cover. I forget the full site title. That's right, of course. I should have guessed. It's on emptiness. Insight into emptiness, exactly. So that's a good book. The True Truth. If you want to learn more about the True Truth, Guy Newland, a shorter version, a more extensive version. I haven't read them myself, but I heard that they're really good books. So, yeah, great summaries. How to see yourself as you really are. It's more about self, the emptiness of the self, not that much on emptiness in general, but it's also a nice introduction by His Holiness. So there are many books out now, and oftentimes just Googling books on emptiness, you have a whole list on them. So that's how Google is very helpful, of course. Yeah. So yes, please.
I want to say something. I watched a course that you teach in this book, Insight into...
Pardon?
How to see yourself as you really are.
What about that book?
You teach a course?
I did teach a course on that.
YouTube.
Yes, that's some years ago I did. It's quite a few years ago.
It's in YouTube,
7, 8 years.
so if you are reading the book, you can, everybody can watch the course.
But there are also other teachers, like really good teachers who can teach, who've taught this book. So they're definitely also... I mean, I've heard me talk for so long, now you need someone else to give you a good explanation.
I have a question.
Mm-hmm.
Why it says, I don't know how it's in Tibetan, but why it says should be known as truth since it is not false. Like in Tibetan is same, it's like, why is it that?
Well, it's not deceptive, right? In the sense like emptiness is the truth in that it's not deceptive. Deceptive, you remember I talked about conventional truth are false or deceptive. They're not actual truth. The word truth, of course, it has many different meanings. In Western philosophy, it refers oftentimes to concepts, to principles, to abstract principles. No, but in Buddhism, it refers to the objects themselves, and it refers to certain characteristic in the context of the true truth. Don't think of the Four Noble Truth. That is slightly different. Why they're called truth? Because they're seen on a conventional level to accord with reality. For those Arya beings who've realized ultimate reality, those Four Noble Truths on a conventional level are seen to accord with conventional reality. But when we talk about, here in this context, we talk about emptiness, and of course the other aspect of phenomena, which is conventional truth, emptiness being the ultimate truth, and there's the conventional truth. And what is really important to understand about emptiness is that it's a truth from the point of view of not just being in accordance with reality, but also when it's directly perceived by a mind, it appears the way it exists. Whereas other phenomena, that is conventional truth, they're said to be deceptive or false, in that when they appear to the mind, they don't appear the way they exist, in that they always appear to exist inherently. Always, to us. I'm not talking about the Buddha. The Buddha's mind is special. The Buddha's mind is different because he's removed the tendencies to perceive phenomena or to have the appearance of inherent existence. But in our case, yes, all conventional truths are said to be deceptive. Now there's one point that I've mentioned before, and this is a good time to maybe explain why that is so. If you realize emptiness, does emptiness always appear in a truthful way or in a non-deceptive way? The answer is no. Because when you conceptually realize emptiness with a conceptual mind, based on the appearance of the appearance of a concept or a meaning or a generic image, right? At that time, emptiness appears to exist inherently. Okay, so let me give you the scenario. So you think about emptiness. When you think about emptiness, when you reflect on emptiness and eventually come to conceptually or inferentially realize emptiness, it's always the emptiness of a particular object. It's not the emptiness of all phenomena. That would be impossible. Does that make sense?
Why would that be impossible?
With an inferential mind, the inferential mind, its ability is to know an object that is not right in front of it, but it can only focus on one particular object because it relies on one concept. And more than one concept or meaning generality, as it's also called, or mental image, cannot appear to it at one given time. Okay? So it's not like you can think of a Bumba, you can think of a pot and a pillar at the same time. You can't. You can take both to mind, but then your perception of both is not the same as if you would individually think of each one of them. Right? You can get like a general sense, vase and pillar, classic Buddhist example, or table and chair. Yeah. But then to really reflect on a table, you just take to mind the table. And when you're done with it, you take to mind the chair. Now, with regard to emptiness, in a similar way, you focus on a particular emptiness. They say there is a mind that reflects or that thinks about the Four Noble Truths, but the texts are very clear that this is not one mind, but it's a continuum. First truth, second truth, third truth, right? It's a continuum of minds. Because our thoughts are limited in that way. They of course have great abilities on one hand, but they're limited in being able to know the emptiness of, well, more than one phenomenon. Or as I said, if you take two phenomena, like you see them together, but you never have a full sense of each one of them, because you can't give enough attention to all of them, and their concepts have to appear. Okay? So, therefore, a conceptual mind can't do it. The thing is, like right now, it seems, but you need to learn more about the conceptual mind. We spend many years, especially when we study what's called the Pramanavartika, the text on logic, first chapter, spent many years on what the conceptual mind does. The thinking mind does. How does an object appear to it? By negating anything that is not it. In other words, the mind automatically eliminates. It's not like, it's not this, it's not this, it's not this. This is how we think of elimination. But the way it gets, for instance, at a chair, is by perceiving its object by way of an image that is the opposite of not being it. Right? By just eliminating anything that doesn't have the main defining characteristics. And the main defining characteristics are just a course, are just what represents a chair to you. Right? Like when I say think of your mother, in that moment, thinking of your mother is just a general image, what you associate with her in that very moment. So her defining characteristics. It's just a negation, this image you have is just a negation of anything that is not your mother. So a very rough sense. And in that way you can think about your mother. But at any given time, one single image appears and then you replace it with something else. And sometimes we have very fast thoughts that are like in Tibetan you would say like a a turning, a whirling fire wheel, like a turning fire. You know, like when you take a lamp or like a what do you call it, like a lantern, and you turn it fast enough, or stick that one side of the stick burns, right? And you twirl it fast enough, it seems to be an actual wheel. Yeah, it seems to be an actual wheel. It looks like a closed entity, but in each moment, the fire is actually in a different spot. But because our mind is not able to perceive an object if it's really, really short, it is no longer able to perceive just that in itself, separate from everything else. That's why I said for perception to take place, for understanding to take place, you need a certain amount of moments. These individual moments are not in themselves able to do so. So when you turn it too fast, your mind is not able to recognize the individual moments, but only this whole thing. But that is just an optical illusion. So to us, it seems it's just one closed circle, when in actuality, or in other words, we think the light is in the same spot at the same time, right? Similarly with our thoughts, when they're too quick, we have a sense it all happens at the same time. Yes? To give you another example, even our sense consciousnesses, it is said that even our sense consciousnesses cannot know their objects simultaneously. I gave you the example of watching telly, watching television, hearing the dialogue, so eye consciousness, ear consciousness. Someone burned some incense, nose consciousness. You're eating a sandwich at the same time, tongue consciousness, and someone gives you a massage. Wouldn't that be perfect? That's what you need to do after this course is over. Get a sandwich, get a telly, get some incense and someone to massage. And do the experiment. Anyway, so in that moment, your perception, you're knowing the smell of the incense, knowing what's going on. It switches so quickly back and forth. So the other sense consciousnesses, there are awarenesses to which the object appears, but is not ascertained, right? However, since conversations are not that fast on the telly or anywhere, you can very quickly switch back and forth. There's no problem. It seems to be simultaneous to our own perception, our own awareness of how we are aware. Since it switches so quickly back and forth, there's a sense of simultaneous perception, or simultaneous, not just perception, but simultaneous cognition, or knowledge of what's going on, right? Realizing what's actually appearing to your mind. But that's not the case. So similarly, if we get a sense how even our sense consciousnesses that easily perceive something because it's right in front of them, or at the very least right in front of them, or really close to the body, right? I mean, like in terms of heat, in terms of taste, smell, and so forth, where the body contact needs to be there, where they actually literally touch. So in that case, if that's not possible for the sense consciousnesses to take in the information simultaneously, why should it be possible for the mental consciousness? I mean, anyway, so having said all that, when you realize emptiness conceptually, especially in the beginning, it's one object. It's hard enough. That's why there's a lot of discussion. What should you start with? What could that first object be? Maybe the self, since we're so obsessing about the self all the time and it's all about I, me, and mine, may as well start there. Or an external object. Although we're so much obsessing about the I, we don't understand that I. But we are quite familiar with cars and tables and so forth, with all its parts. So that may be easier for that reason. But you start with an easy object. But then, when that appears to the mind, when you understand, let's say, the emptiness of the self, for the first time with that inferential mind, the emptiness appears to exist inherently. the concept of emptiness, that generic image or that mental image of emptiness that appears to exist inherently. So you still have the appearance of inherent existence. But when you realize emptiness directly, what happens is, when it's a direct experience, it is of all phenomena. It's all the emptiness there is, in other words. No conventional truth appears to that mind. It is just the inherent existence, and therefore the inherent existence of everything. Because when you talk about general inherent existence, that includes all lack of inherent existence. I said inherent existence, sorry. When you realize the lack of inherent existence, just that includes the lack of inherent existence of all phenomena. And since you realize the lack of inherent existence of all phenomena, by way of the lack of inherent existence of all phenomena appearing to your mind, what has also appeared to your mind? The lack of inherent existence of the lack of inherent existence. The lack of inherent existence of any mental image. Right? The lack of inherent existence of any object. That appears to your mind. So how can any object appear to exist inherently if it appears to as if it appears as if lacking inherent existing? Sorry, now I'm getting confused. If it appears to lack inherent existence, right? How can that be? Which is why it's impossible. Everything to that mind, since you're so immersed in emptiness, you directly realize emptiness, therefore you realize the emptiness of all phenomena, and everything appears with its emptiness. And there's no room in your mind, there's no possibility for your mind to have anything appear to it as existing inherently, because everything appears to lack inherent existence. And these two appearances are contradictory. You can't have something appear as inherently existing and as not inherently existing. You can have, and that's the case of the conventional consciousness, you can have the self appear as lacking inherent existence when you conceptually realize the lack of inherent existence of the self. So yes, the self appears as lacking inherent existence, but the emptiness appears to exist inherently. You see? So one thing appears to exist inherently, and something else to that mind appears to lack inherent existence. That is possible. It's part of the appearance of this. So if you then wonder, oh, two things appear to a conceptual mind, yeah, but it's all part and parcel of the appearance of the lack of inherent existence of the self. So there's no contradiction. Okay, this is really complicated, and I'm aware that it is. But every now and then, this is an advanced class. I mean, that's the title of this class. So a little bit advanced teaching to just prepare your mind to make it more flexible. And of course, if you then pursue it further, hopefully to understand the more detailed explanations on what you're going to study. Right? Does that make sense? So briefly, just briefly. Okay, her question was, why do you say that emptiness is non-deceptive? It's a truth, saying this perfection of wisdom. And of course here it's talking about emptiness itself, because emptiness was taught. The perfection of wisdom was taught indirectly. Really, what it teaches is emptiness itself. No eye, no ear, no nose. It's not talking about a mind that is called a perfection of wisdom. No, it's talking about its object. And here that object is given the name perfection of wisdom. And that is the truth. It's not deceptive. When you directly perceive it, you won't be deceived by a false appearance of inherent existence. Does that make sense? That's the only time we're not deceived. Because otherwise, other than this mind, inherent existence always appears. Which is why it's so hard for us. It would be easy to say, well, think of your eye consciousness. If your eye consciousness didn't have any inherent appearance. All we need to say is, well, we need to just point at. We just need to point out to you your eye consciousness, saying, Well, think of your eye consciousness, how things appear to it. This is how they exist. Right? You remember when I talked about the person who lives close to this smelly factory or like a garbage dump, whatever, and they don't know what a clean smell that everyone else would call a clean smell or a non-polluted smell. They don't know what that is like because they've never traveled somewhere else, have no idea. Only when you take them to the place where they can smell something else, when they then go back, they become aware of it. But as long as you're immersed in that smell and you don't know anything other, you won't be able to distinguish it, which is why it's so difficult for us to distinguish between inherent existence and non-inherent existence, because we are only familiar with the appearance of inherent existence. That's why it's so difficult. Not because it's difficult in and of itself. No, it's difficult in relation to our minds. For a Buddha, realizing emptiness and realizing a cup, just as easy. Okay. All right. I know this is really complicated, but again, it puts things into perspective. Yeah. James?
From when you were breaking down emptiness and how we have these understandings, and I just want to see if this train of thought is correct.
Mm-hmm.
So, yes, we were talking about the eye, external phenomena. So, it starts with the initial metaphysical understanding of emptiness, which thus gives rise to the conceptual understanding of emptiness that is not still empty in itself, because we have just now thoroughly understood our metaphysical world.
It's emptiness itself, but by way of the image.
By not declaring inherent existence on phenomena, because I have come to understanding conceptually, so metaphysical, and all of my external surroundings. Then we move to the conceptual, even though, yes, the metaphysical is still, we use that as the conceptual, but now we're looking towards the negation of emptiness in itself to reach the experiential state of emptiness. Then, so if that follows, then I want to kind of like move back to where we were talking about how we have to concentrate on a single object. Similarly, when you made the example of our sense perception, our sense faculties, and how we can only focus on one at a time. And now this is kind of like a follow-on question. Do you believe that it's possible that I'm not specifically focusing on, let's say, the smell, and even though I'm being bombarded by all these other sensory objects, do you believe it's possible to almost like take a step back and see that the commonality that they all share is a sense faculty in itself?
Okay, James, let me interrupt you.
Okay.
Let me interrupt you here. You need to study logic.
Okay.
You need to study what is called awareness and knowledge about the mind, because there's a lot of confusion right now, and unfortunately, I can't add these. I can't, all the holes that are still there in those confusions. I can't address those right here. So don't worry about it. I mean, I've addressed something that is confusing in itself, and it leads to new questions. But of course, that's why we usually study certain topics about the mind. Okay? There's so many questions contained in what you just asked, or so many aspects. Never mind about them. But just get a general sense. We end up with the wrong view of emptiness. That wrong view, believing in inherent existence, that leads to doubt first. Well, maybe there is emptiness, maybe there isn't. There probably isn't. And then it's like kind of an equal doubt. Yeah, there is, maybe there isn't, kind of. And then doubt tending towards the fact, probably phenomena lack inherent existence, but I'm still undecided about it, right? And then you move from there to what's called conviction. Correctly assuming, right? Correctly assuming, say, correct conviction. Oh, it makes sense. Yes, I'm sure they are. But that's still not realizing it. And then you move on to specifically focusing on a particular object. In general, different objects were given as examples right here and there and everywhere. And yeah, probably phenomena lack. Now you focus, in order to realize it, on a particular phenomenon. Let's take the self. And you focus in on that and you realize it conceptually, still having the appearance of inherent existence. And then afterwards you take such an inferential cognition and you use another basis. Table, chair, body, and so forth. The 18 constituents, the 12 sense sources. The text gives you lots of bases to reflect on. Even the Buddha himself, even the attainments themselves, even love and compassion, and so forth. And once you've done that long enough and you've combined it with what? Concentration, union of calm abiding and special insight. Once you've done that, your mind has become very stable, has become very focused. And that focused mind, focusing on particular objects, the self, for instance, changing them if you like, at some point that mind turns into a direct perception. While you're meditating, while you're meditating, conceptually you're reflecting on the emptiness of a particular object, and the emptiness becomes clearer and clearer and clearer until your image, your general image, your concept, the finger, it disappears. It no longer appears. And you directly experience emptiness. That much is all you need to know. So you go from there slowly to that direct experience. And all the other questions you have, study Lorik, they'll be answered. Lorik is the Tibetan word. It's another word for awareness and knowledge. Mind in Tibetan Buddhism. That's the book to read, but it's really difficult. So try to get a teaching on mind, on the mind. What is the mind? The different types of mind, the different objects. Yes, please.
May I mention a
Yes.
program of FPMT will start in
Okay.
September.
Okay. Yes.
Where it will be teach.
There are study programs, yes, by the FPMT of these particular topics. A new program starting, but also old programs that have already been covered. So there's a lot available now, right? A lot of recordings. Buddhist psychology, it's also called, yeah, giving it a slightly fancier name, Buddhist psychology. But it comes down to what's called Lorik in Tibetan, which is another word for awareness and knowledge, to translate it kind of slightly loosely. But yeah, anyway.
So,
Okay, wait, are we going to open it? Let's open it to questions now. Is that okay to have some questions? But let's take a break first, if that's okay, because I'm just seeing it's a little, yeah. So I'll take a few questions, and then we start with Tantra.